Revealing its clutches. How does the CCP endanger the world? Part 3. Hello everyone, welcome to the China Probe channel. I'm Alin, and it's a pleasure to explore recent China issues with you. Today's topic focuses on the dangers the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, poses to the world. To explain them clearly, this topic has been divided into a 4-part series. This video is part 3, focusing on the Belt and Road. Since coming to power, CCP leader Xi Jinping has consistently promoted the vision of building a community with a shared future for mankind. In 2013, he introduced the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, as its cornerstone, seeking to expand the CCP's global influence. According to official CCP statistics, 47 centrally state-owned enterprises have participated in, invested in, or held shares in 1,676 belt and road projects, covering 3 major sectors: infrastructure, energy, and industrial development. These projects include the China-Russia, China-Kazakhstan, and China-Myanmar crude oil pipelines, along with numerous coal-fired, hydroelectric, and nuclear power plants. From January to October 2025, Chinese companies' non-financial direct investment in Belt and Road countries reached 234.15 billion Chinese yuan, $32.71 billion US dollars. Representing a year-on-year increase of 21.4%. However, the Belt and Road has increasingly been criticized as glittering on the outside but rotten within. Several recurring problems have emerged. 1. Corruption and poor construction quality. Taiwanese financial analyst Huang Shitsung pointed out that many Belt and Road projects are massive in scale and technically demanding, yet often fail to meet the actual needs of host countries. He noted that multi-billion-dollar projects such as power plants and airports create enormous opportunities for corruption. Collusion easily occurs between local governments and executives of Chinese state-owned enterprises and often results in substandard construction. In March 2025, the new State Audit Office building under construction in Bangkok, Thailand, collapsed after the Myanmar earthquake. It was the only building in Bangkok to collapse during the quake. China Railway No. 10 Engineering Group was one of the project's main contractors. Meanwhile, the CCP has spent years constructing oil pipelines across the strategically important Middle East. Yet, after the outbreak of the US-Iran war, many of these pipelines have remained unused. One possible explanation is that numerous projects suffer from shoddy construction. Some reportedly collapsed before construction was even completed. 2. Wage arrears and a crisis of credibility. As China's domestic economy has remained sluggish, and many state-owned enterprises have accumulated heavy debts, reports of unpaid wages on overseas Belt and Road projects have become increasingly common. Workers in at least 14 countries, including Guinea, Cambodia, Tanzania, Belarus, and Saudi Arabia, have reportedly experienced wage delays ranging from several months to half a year. Shenming Shi, a researcher at Taiwan's Institute for National Defense and Security Research, explained that the Belt and Road Initiative was built from the outset on the model of China provides the financing, and Chinese state-owned enterprises do the construction, rather than host countries paying directly. Since overseas projects cannot simply be halted or lay off workers, unpaid wages have become increasingly common, further damaging the initiative's credibility. 3. Export restrictions and a crisis of trust. The CCP frequently describes its relationships with partner countries as win-win cooperation. However, when supply chain disruptions occur, the fragility of these partnerships quickly becomes apparent. Following the outbreak of the US-Iran war at the end of February 2026, CCP imposed strict restrictions on exports of fertilizers and fuel. As a result, neighboring countries that had become heavily dependent on Chinese supply chains found themselves facing severe shortages, effectively abandoned when they needed assistance most. Current affairs commentator Yue Shan argued that the CCP's economic commitments are often driven primarily by political objectives. Whenever a crisis arises, Beijing prioritizes protecting its own interests domestically, he added. The CCP consistently places the interests of political elites above those of ordinary citizens. While the regime may believe it has prepared itself well, ignoring the suffering of neighboring countries is steadily eroding the international trust it has spent years trying to cultivate. 4. The debt trap. Through state-backed lending for large infrastructure projects across Asia, Europe, Africa, and Latin America, China has become the world's largest bilateral creditor. However, many countries with fragile economies have found themselves trapped by unsustainable debt. Several examples illustrate this pattern. Tajikistan borrowed $300 million from China to construct a power plant. Unable to repay the loan, it ultimately granted Chinese companies the mining rights to the Upper Kumarg and Eastern Duoba gold mines. Sri Lanka, overwhelmed by debt, was forced to lease the Hambantota port to China for 99 years, triggering widespread domestic opposition. After Greece's sovereign debt crisis, the CCP seized the opportunity to inject large amounts of capital and, within a few years, gained control of the country's largest port, Piraeus. Other economically vulnerable European countries that have similarly attracted Beijing's attention include Spain, Portugal, and Hungary. When accused of practicing debt trap diplomacy, Beijing typically offers 4 arguments. A. Many developing countries owe more debt to Western lenders than to China. B. Rising U.S. interest rates caused these countries' debt crises. C. Currency depreciation and the global economic slowdown are the real causes. D. China rarely confiscates the assets of countries unable to repay their debts. A report by the Sydney-based Lowy Institute strongly challenged these claims. Regarding the first argument, the report acknowledged that it is mathematically true but highly misleading. Western lenders largely stopped extending new loans to avoid pushing vulnerable countries into default, whereas China continued lending and took advantage of the resulting financing gap. Regarding rising U.S. interest rates, the report noted that responsible lenders had already reduced their exposure, while China continued issuing loans, often at interest rates significantly higher than those offered by the International Monetary Fund, IMF. As for currency depreciation and slowing economic growth, the report described CCP's reasoning as illogical, particularly because most Belt and Road loans are denominated in US dollars. Finally, concerning CCP's claim that it rarely seizes foreign assets, the report argued that CCP often provides debt relief through refinancing or loan extensions, thereby deepening borrowers' dependence rather than reducing it. In the end, countries that remain unable to repay often have little choice but to surrender strategic assets. In reality, the CCP's ambitions extend far beyond a few years, they are measured in generations. Regardless of the cost or the welfare of the Chinese people, Beijing seeks to export corruption, debt, authoritarianism, and its political model to neighboring countries. The CCP has spread communist influence worldwide through its United Front strategy, cultivating pro-CCP governments and political elites. Its ultimate ambition is to be the leader of the developing world across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, enabling it to challenge the United States and other democratic nations in international institutions such as the United Nations. and eventually replace the United States as the world's leading superpower. One frequently cited example is Greece, which has repeatedly used its political influence within the European Union to block resolutions critical of the CCP's human rights record and policies. Commentator Xiang Yun argued that the widespread penetration of CCP influence into democratic societies stems from two principal factors. A. Many countries fail to recognize the CCP's authoritarian nature and are persuaded by its rhetoric. B. Material interests have too often been placed above democratic values and moral principles, encouraging governments to accommodate Beijing and inadvertently invite greater political influence. He warned that excessive tolerance and openness toward the CCP could ultimately bring devastating consequences for nations, societies, and their democratic institutions. Although the CCP has established strategic footholds in various parts of the world, many countries have begun taking countermeasures. Singapore has long served as one of the Belt and Road key hubs in Southeast Asia and is itself a majority ethnic Chinese society. Nevertheless, during a visit to China, former Prime Minister and current Senior Minister Li Xianlong publicly rejected CCP's long-standing narrative that overseas Chinese and mainland Chinese are united by a common ancestry and political identity. Singapore has consistently maintained a high level of vigilance against the CCP's United Front activities, most notably through the enactment of the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act, FICA. In 2023, the United States and the European Union launched the Lobito Corridor project in Africa, establishing a major transportation route linking Angola, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Zambia to facilitate exports of critical minerals. It represents the largest and most strategically significant U.S.-supported infrastructure initiative in Africa in decades and is intended to reshape African supply chains while reducing China's dominant influence. Huang Shitsung also noted that the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, and several other countries have introduced alternative infrastructure partnerships to compete with the Belt and Road. Countries that once had little choice but to cooperate with CCP now have additional options. Finally, commentator Wang Yukan cited four recent developments. A. The Russia-North Korea Tumen River Highway Bridge, completed in 2025, effectively restricts the passage of medium and large Chinese vessels from northeast China. B. The Panama Canal, one of the world's most strategically important maritime choke points connecting the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, had been targeted by Beijing in an effort to secure control of port facilities at both ends through Chinese state-owned enterprises. However, in early 2026, Panamanian authorities forcibly took over the ports. C. The Strait of Hormuz is the only sea route connecting the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean. Following the U.S.-Iran War, U.S. military operations significantly disrupted the CCP's access to Iranian oil. D. In April 2026, the U.S. Secretary of War met with Indonesia's Minister of Defense at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., where both sides announced the establishment of a major defense partnership. Should Indonesia permit unrestricted overflight of the Strait of Malacca by U.S. military aircraft, a future U.S.-China conflict could enable the United States to blockade this critical shipping lane. This method will severely restrict CCP's access to Middle Eastern oil while disrupting its export trade. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. Please press like, share, and subscribe. Your support is my greatest motivation. Feel free to leave your comments below. See you next time.